Doris Hale had been sleeping on her daughter's couch for 63 days when the auction notice appeared in the free weekly paper she picked up from the rack outside the laundromat on Birch Street. Not her daughter's couch by preference. Patricia's apartment had 2 bedrooms, one of which belonged to Patricia's 9-year-old son Marcus, and the other of which belonged to Patricia, and the living room couch belonged to nobody, and had therefore become Doris's by necessity, in the way that things which belong to nobody tend to belong to whoever needs them most urgently. It was a reasonable couch, firm in the middle and soft at both ends in a way that Doris had learned to manage by sleeping diagonally, which worked adequately for a woman of her height and not at all for her lower back, which had opinions about the arrangement that it expressed consistently and without diplomacy every morning around 5. She had not planned to be here. That needed saying because it was true, and because the gap between where Doris had expected to be at 72 and where she actually was deserved to be acknowledged honestly, rather than papered over with the kind of cheerful pragmatism she performed for Patricia's benefit during the waking hours. She had expected to be in the house on Sycamore Drive, the house she and her husband Raymond had bought in 1987 with a down payment that had taken them 6 years to save, and that they had spent the following decades paying off and maintaining and improving in the patient, incremental way of people who understood that a house was not a purchase, but a practice. Raymond had died 4 years ago, a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in April that had arrived without warning and taken him in the time it took Doris to walk from the kitchen to the living room to ask if he wanted more coffee. She had managed after, the way she had always managed things, with the focused, steady application of effort that had been her primary tool throughout a life that had not been particularly easy and had not particularly needed to be easy in order to be good. What she had not managed adequately, and what she understood now, in the clear, unsentimental light of retrospect, was the financial situation that Raymond had been handling for the final years of his life, and that she had not examined closely enough in the years immediately following his death. Raymond had been a good man, and an imperfect financial manager, and the combination of those two things had produced a situation that revealed itself slowly, and then completely, over the 3 years after his passing. A second mortgage she had not known was as large as it was. Investment decisions made in the last years of his illness that had not performed as hoped. A life insurance policy that had covered significantly less than she had believed it would. By the time she understood the full picture, the house on Sycamore Drive had been sold to cover what needed covering, and Doris had moved into a rental apartment with the proceeds that remained, which were modest, and had spent 2 years being careful until careful was not sufficient, and the rental had become impossible. And Patricia had said without hesitation that Doris should come, and that the couch was hers for as long as she needed it. Patricia meant it. Doris knew she meant it. The couch was genuinely offered and genuinely available, and Marcus had adjusted to his grandmother's presence with the resilience of a 9-year-old who understood that the situation was serious, without understanding all of its dimensions. Doris was grateful in a way that had no adequate expression, and that she demonstrated instead through cooking elaborate dinners and keeping the living room immaculate, and asking Patricia nothing that required anything beyond a simple answer. She had $63 in her account. She had her Social Security payment, which arrived on the second Wednesday of each month and was gone by the end of the same week, after her contributions to the household expenses she had insisted on making despite Patricia's protests. She had her health, which was the good news, the thing she repeated to herself on the mornings when the couch and the back and the 5 o'clock consciousness conspired to make the situation feel less manageable than she needed it to feel. She picked up the free weekly paper because it had crossword puzzles, which she did in the laundromat while her clothes were in the machines, sitting in the plastic chair nearest the window, with a pen she kept in her coat pocket for this specific purpose. She found the auction notice on page 7, between an advertisement for a tax preparation service and a community announcement about a road closure. The Mineral County Tax Authority would be conducting a public auction of seized properties on the 14th of the month. Properties listed included a commercial storage unit on Route 9, a vacant residential lot on the east side, and a former ranger station on Forest Service Road 14 in the hills outside Creston, seized following the dissolution of the private conservation trust that had held it for 20 years and the failure of the trust's remaining trustees to maintain tax payments on the property. Outstanding liability on the ranger station parcel was listed at $10. $10. She read it twice. She looked at the crossword puzzle. She looked back at the auction notice. She tore the page carefully from the paper, which she felt mildly guilty about, and then decided was acceptable given the circumstances, and folded it into her coat pocket and sat with it against her ribs through the rest of the laundry cycle. She had been for 31 years before her retirement a Forest Service administrative coordinator. Not a ranger, not a field position, a coordinator, which meant she had spent 3 decades as the person who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who had to be told before anything could actually happen. She had processed more paperwork relating to Forest Service properties, their acquisition, their maintenance, their transfer, their disposal, than she could begin to estimate. She knew what a ranger station was, and what it contained, and what it sat on, and what the implications of that land classification were in terms of access, use rights, and the specific regulatory frameworks that govern properties at the intersection of federal land management and private holding. She knew things about this category of property that most people who were not her did not know. She also knew, because she had spent 31 years in the administrative infrastructure of an organization that was thorough about some things and remarkably careless about others, that the paperwork trail attached to former ranger stations that had passed through private trust arrangements was frequently more complicated and more interesting than the assessed value of the structure suggested. Patricia was at work. Marcus was at school. Doris sat in the laundry room of Patricia's apartment building and folded her clothes into the basket and thought carefully for 20 minutes. Then she went upstairs, put her clothes away, and called the Mineral County Tax Authority. The woman who answered at the county office was named Beverly and had the efficient telephone manner of a person who handled routine inquiries all day and could identify a non-routine one within the first 30 seconds of a call. Doris was not a non-routine caller in her presentation. She asked her questions in the organized, specific language of someone with administrative experience, which meant she got organized, specific answers, rather than the hedged generalities that Beverly apparently deployed for callers who did not know what they were asking about. The ranger station on Forest Service Road 14 had been built in 1953 as a fire watch and trail management post. It had operated under federal management until 1987, when a budget reorganization had resulted in its transfer to a private conservation trust that had taken on several such properties in the region under an arrangement that was common in that era and that had produced mixed results in the decades since, depending on the financial health of the receiving organization. The Creston Conservation Trust had managed the property adequately until approximately 12 years ago, when the organization had begun a slow dissolution driven by the retirement and death of its founding members and the failure to recruit sufficient replacements. The property had been maintained at a basic level for several years after that, and then not maintained at all. The tax payments had lapsed. The county had seized the property after the standard notification period, and it was now available at auction for the outstanding liability. Beverly said the outstanding liability was $10. Doris asked about the land parcel, the acreage, the classification, the access arrangements. Beverly put her on hold. She came back 3 minutes later and read from what was evidently the property file. The ranger station sat on 4.2 acres. The land was classified as mixed-use rural under the county's current zoning, reflecting the change in classification that had accompanied the transfer from federal to private management in 1987. The access road, Forest Service Road 14, was a county-maintained road for the first 2 miles from the highway and an unclassified private road for the remaining 1.5 miles to the property. Doris asked about the structure. Beverly said the structure was described in the most recent county inspection, which was 6 years old, as a single-story timber frame building of approximately 600 square feet in fair to poor condition, with an attached storage structure of approximately 200 square feet in poor condition, and an underground utility installation of unspecified type that had been noted in the inspection report as requiring further assessment. Doris said, "Could Beverly repeat the last item?" Beverly repeated it. An underground utility installation of unspecified type. Doris wrote it in the margin of the auction notice she had unfolded on Patricia's kitchen table. She thanked Beverly and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at what she had written and thought about 31 years of administrative coordination for an organization that built things underground when it needed to protect things from fire, from weather, from the particular vulnerabilities that above-ground storage created in environments where the risk profile was high. She knew what underground utility installations at ranger stations built in the 1950s frequently were. She was not going to assume. Assumption was the error she had spent her career correcting in other people. She was going to go and look. She counted the money in her wallet. $63. The auction was in 4 days. Forest Service Road 14 was, according to the county map she pulled up on Marcus's tablet, approximately 40 minutes from Patricia's apartment by car. She did not have a car. She called her friend Greta, who was 71 and retired, and lived 20 minutes away, and who owned a 10-year-old Subaru and no particular plans for a Thursday, and who had known Doris for long enough to understand that when Doris asked for something, she had a reason that was worth hearing. Greta came on Thursday morning. They drove to Forest Service Road 14. The first 1.5 miles of the road was in reasonable condition, and the second 1.5 miles was a philosophical position on the concept of a road, rather than an actual road. A pair of tire tracks through increasingly dense forest that required Greta's full concentration and her Subaru's full ground clearance, and the mutual unspoken agreement of both women not to comment on how the surrounding terrain was looking. The station appeared in a small clearing at the end of the track. It was smaller than 600 square feet suggested when you were standing in front of it, which was always the way with described measurements and actual spaces. A single-story timber building with a covered porch along the front face and a metal roof that had rusted to a deep reddish brown that was, structurally speaking, actually a reasonable preservative in this climate. The windows were intact behind metal security screens that had been fitted at some point and that remained locked. The front door was a solid timber door with a deadbolt that was also locked and that showed no signs of having been successfully interfered with. The attached storage structure at the back was in worse condition than the main building, the roof partially compromised, and one wall leaning in a way that required attention before it required replacement. Doris walked the perimeter of the building slowly and completely before she looked at anything else. She had learned this discipline over 31 years of property assessments. You walked the full perimeter before you looked at details because the overall picture organized the details rather than the other way around. What she found on the north side of the building stopped her. A metal hatch set into the ground against the foundation wall, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet. Steel construction with a locking mechanism that was the same vintage as the building itself, which meant 1953 or shortly after. The hatch was set into a concrete surround that had been poured as part of the original construction rather than added later. The metal was corroded on the surface but solid underneath, the kind of corrosion that happened to well-made steel over 70 years of outdoor exposure, and that looked worse than it was. She looked at it for a long time. Greta appeared beside her and looked at it too. Greta said, "What is that?" Doris said she thought it was what she had come to see. She did not try to open it. The lock required a key she did not have, and attempting to force it would have been wrong practically and wrong in principle. She photographed it on her phone from 4 angles. She photographed the concrete surround. She paced out the dimensions of the underground space it likely gave access to based on the position of the hatch and the foundation wall, and the way the ground surface showed the faint rectangular impression of a structure beneath it that extended further than the hatch itself suggested. Her pacing indicated a space of approximately 20 feet by 14 feet. She stood on the ground above it and did the math. 280 square feet of underground space. Built in 1953 by the federal government as part of a ranger station whose operational history she had spent 31 years adjacent to. In an era when the federal government was building things underground at its remote stations with a very specific purpose in mind and sealing them very specifically against access by people who were not authorized. She did not say any of this to Greta. She took her photographs and walked back around to the front of the building and looked at the covered porch and the rusted roof and the locked security screens. She asked Greta if she could borrow $10. Greta looked at her. Doris said she would explain in the car. Greta said she had $12 in her wallet, and Doris could have all of it if she explained properly. Doris said 10 was sufficient, and that she would explain everything on the way back. They drove down the 2.5 miles of Philosophical Road and the 2 miles of actual road, and turned back toward Creston, and Doris explained everything on the way, beginning with the couch and ending with the underground hatch, and everything in between organized in the clear sequential way she had always organized information that mattered. When she finished, Greta was quiet for a moment. Then Greta said she was coming to the auction. Doris said she did not need to come to the auction. Greta said she was coming to the auction. The auction was held in the county administration building on the 14th, in a room with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, and a clerk at a table with a laptop and a gavel that he appeared to be taking more seriously than strictly necessary. There were 11 people in the room. Most of them were there for the commercial storage unit, which generated the majority of the bidding and the room's competitive energy. The vacant residential lot attracted 2 bidders and sold for $400 to a man in a green jacket, who wrote his check without expression. The ranger station was announced third. Doris raised her hand. Nobody else raised theirs. The clerk looked around the room. He asked twice, in the manner required by procedure, whether there were other bidders for the Forest Service Road 14 parcel. There were not. He brought the gavel down. $10. Doris counted it out from the 12 Greta had given her and slid it across the table and received the stamped deed and the key envelope in exchange. The key envelope contained 3 keys on a ring, with a tag identifying them as main door, storage door, and utility access. She held the key ring in her hand for a moment. Utility access. She put the keys in her coat pocket and thanked the clerk, and walked back to where Greta was waiting near the door. Greta said, "Well." Doris said, "Well." They drove back to Patricia's apartment, and Doris sat at the kitchen table and looked at the key ring and thought about what to do next with the organized attention she had been bringing to difficult problems for 72 years. The utility access key was the smallest of the 3, older than the other 2, a heavy brass key of a type that had been standard in federal construction in the 1950s, and that she had seen in supply catalogs from that era during her years of administrative work. It had a number stamped on the bow, a 4-digit code that was a standard federal installation identifier from the construction program it had come from. She wrote the number down. She spent the following morning at the county library, using the research database to trace the construction records of federal installations in the region from 1950 to 1960. It took her 4 hours, and the help of a librarian named James, who was patient and thorough, and who became progressively more interested in what Doris was looking for as the morning went on. What she found, in a digitized archive of federal construction records that had been transferred to the County Historical Repository in the 1990s, was the original construction file for the Creston Ranger Station, Forest Service Road 14, built 1953. The file included a floor plan, the main building, the storage structure, and a third element, described in the construction documentation as an emergency equipment and document storage facility, underground, reinforced concrete construction, climate-controlled by a passive ventilation system, designed to maintain stable temperature and humidity conditions indefinitely without active management. The construction notes describe the facility as having been built to house emergency response equipment, topographic survey archives, and what the documentation referred to as Regional Administrative Records of Permanent Retention Value. Permanent retention value. Doris sat back in her chair. James, the librarian, who had been reading over her shoulder for the past 20 minutes in a way that she had permitted because his attention was useful, said quietly that permanent retention meant the kind of records the federal government considered too important to risk losing in the kinds of emergencies that ranger stations in fire-prone regions were built to survive. Doris said she knew what it meant. She looked at the construction file for a moment longer. Then she looked at the key ring. Then she called Patricia. She said she needed a favor and a ride to a property she had just bought in the hills outside Creston, and that she would explain everything on the way. Patricia was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, "What property?" Doris said she would explain on the way. They went on a Saturday morning, Doris and Patricia and Marcus, who had heard enough of the conversation on Friday evening to make any attempt at leaving him behind, both logistically and morally untenable. Patricia drove. Marcus sat in the back seat with the focused energy of a 9-year-old who had been told something significant was happening and had been warned to be patient, which he was managing imperfectly but genuinely. The philosophical section of Forest Service Road 14 impressed Patricia in the same way it had impressed Greta, which was to say it alarmed her. But the Subaru she had borrowed from Greta, who had insisted on lending it for the occasion, handled it as it had handled it before. The clearing and the station appeared at the end of the track in the same way they had appeared before, gradually, and then all at once. Doris unlocked the front door with the main key, and they went inside. The interior of the main building was a single room with a kitchen area, a bathroom, a desk and shelving unit along one wall, and a communications installation that was 40 years obsolete but completely intact. Everything was covered in the dust of abandonment, but nothing was damaged in any structural sense. The security screens on the windows had kept the opportunistic interference that would otherwise have occurred over 20 years of vacancy entirely at bay. Marcus looked at the communications equipment with the expression of a child encountering something from a world that preceded him by enough years to qualify as archaeology. Patricia looked around the room, and then looked at Doris with an expression that contained several questions she was organizing into a priority sequence. Doris said, "Come around the back." They walked to the north side of the building. The hatch was exactly as she had left it, steel and concrete and the heavy brass lock. She took the utility access key from the ring and crouched beside the hatch, and inserted the key and felt it engage with the mechanism in the deliberate way of a well-made lock that had been waiting for the correct key, and recognized it without difficulty. She turned it. The mechanism released with a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep internal movement of well-engineered parts. She lifted the hatch. The smell that came up was not the smell of decay or damage. It was the smell of sealed space, cool and dry and still, the smell of air that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time, in a container that had been built to maintain exactly those conditions. Marcus said, "Wow." Doris said, "Stay here." She went down the concrete steps that led below the hatch, which were solid and dry, and exactly as the construction file had described them, and found the light switch on the left wall at the bottom, which was where federal construction standards of that era always put it, and turned it on. The fluorescent tubes took a moment to warm. They flickered twice, and then came on fully, illuminating a room of 280 square feet of reinforced concrete construction, with metal shelving units along 3 walls, and a central floor space, and a ventilation grill in the ceiling that had been doing its passive maintenance work continuously for 70 years without anyone asking it to. On the shelves were boxes, federal document boxes of the standard issue variety from the 1950s through the 1980s, stacked in organized rows with identifying labels on the ends. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, military gray, locked. A set of metal map tubes in a rack along the back wall, each labeled in the careful hand of someone who had understood that these records needed to be findable by whoever came after them. And along the right wall, on a separate set of heavier shelving that had been built to hold more weight than paper required, something else. Equipment cases, metal, sealed, stacked in rows, of a type that Doris recognized from 31 years of administrative work, involving exactly these kinds of remote federal installations, and the equipment that had been stored in them, and that had been listed in inventory logs she had processed, and then superseded by new inventory logs, and then forgotten, in the way that things were forgotten when organizations changed their priorities and their storage arrangements, but did not always follow through on the disposal of what they had moved past. She stood in the fluorescent light of the underground room for a moment. Then she went back up the stairs to where Patricia and Marcus were waiting at the hatch opening. Patricia said, "Mom, what is down there?" Doris said she needed to make some calls before she could answer that fully. She said that some of what was down there was paper records that would need to be assessed for historical and administrative significance. She said that some of what was down there was equipment that would need to be properly identified and valued. She said that her preliminary assessment, based on 31 years of working with these types of installations and the types of equipment they had housed and the ways in which that equipment had been tracked and categorized and occasionally lost in the administrative transitions between federal management and private trust arrangements, was that the contents of the room below them were considerably more significant than the $10 assessed value of the property they were standing on. Patricia stared at her. Marcus said, "How much more significant?" Doris said she would know more after the calls. She took out her phone. The first call was to a former colleague named Howard, who had spent his career in federal records management and who knew more about what Ranger Station document archives from the 1950s contained and what they were worth to the right institutions than anyone else she could think of. The second call was to a woman named Dr. Sarah Kimball, who taught at the State University and who had published 3 papers on federal survey archives and their significance for historical land use research, and who Doris had read in the months before her retirement and had filed away in her memory as the kind of person you would want to call if you ever found yourself standing above 280 square feet of sealed federal records in a clearing in the hills outside Creston. Howard answered on the second ring and listened for 4 minutes without interrupting, and then said, in the specific tone of a man whose professional composure was being tested, that she should not open any of the filing cabinets or touch any of the equipment cases until he had spoken to 2 people he needed to speak to. She said she had not intended to open anything without proper process. Howard said he knew she hadn't, and that was why he wanted to talk to 2 specific people before anything else happened. Dr. Kimball did not answer. Doris left a message that was precise and specific, and which, she was confident, would result in a return call before the end of the day. She put her phone in her pocket and looked at Patricia and Marcus at the edge of the hatch opening, her daughter and her grandson in a clearing in the hills on a Saturday morning, looking at her with expressions that were different versions of the same thing. The look of people who had understood that something had shifted, but not yet understood how far the shift was going to go. She thought about 63 days on a couch with opinions about her lower back. She thought about a free weekly paper and a crossword puzzle pen and a torn-out page in her coat pocket. She thought about Greta's $12 and a brass key with a 4-digit federal identifier and 31 years of knowing where things were and how things worked and what the paperwork meant when you read it carefully enough. She thought about the house on Sycamore Drive and Raymond and the coffee she had been about to bring him and did not bring him, and the years since that morning that had been managed rather than lived, adequate rather than chosen, until a Thursday morning in a laundromat when a page in a free paper had been between her and the crossword puzzle, and she had read it instead. Marcus said, "Gran, are you okay?" She said she was perfectly fine. She looked at the hatch. She looked at the clearing and the station with its rusted roof and its locked security screens and its covered porch and its 4.2 acres of mixed-use rural land at the end of a road that most people would not bother to drive. She said they should go inside and she would make tea and they would wait for Howard to call back. Patricia said there was no kettle. Doris said she had put one in the bag in the car because she had learned a long time ago to anticipate what a situation was going to require, and a situation involving important phone calls and people who needed to wait calmly always required tea. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she went to get the bag from the car. Marcus stayed at the hatch and looked down into the underground room with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who had been told something significant was happening and had been patient about it for long enough and was now done being patient. He said it looked like the beginning of something. Doris stood beside him and looked down at the fluorescent light and the shelves and the sealed cases and the 70 years of careful preservation waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She said she thought he was right about that. She put her hand on his shoulder, and they stood together in the clearing while Patricia came back with the bag and the kettle. And somewhere in the hills around them, the forest was doing what forests did in the late morning of a clear Saturday, which was simply continuing to exist in the particular unhurried way of things that had been there long before anyone arrived, and intended to be there long after. Doris had $10 left in her account, and a deed in her pocket, and a key ring with a brass key that had opened something that had been waiting to be opened for 70 years. She was 72 years old. She was just getting started.